Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell. We start this week with an interview with the Department of Revenue Director, David Harris, House Republican most recently, and Governor Pritzker picked you off to lead up his tax agency, if you will. First of all, before we get into some of the news of recent developments here, what was that like as a Republican deciding to work with the Democratic administration, and how would you describe that relationship that you have now with the governor?
Mark, I have to tell you, first of all, it's good to be with you today, but I have to tell you, it was a real honor for me to be selected by the governor. As you say, I served 18 years in the House of Representatives. All 18 years I served as a member of the Revenue Committee. I was on the Appropriations Committee for 8 years, so I understood tax policy, I understood budgeting. And the governor, during the course of his campaign, and when he came in, he said he wants to reach across the aisle, he wants to operate in a bipartisan way, and he approached and he said, would you be willing to be the Department of Revenue Director? I was absolutely honored that he asked me, and I'm thrilled to be there. I got to tell you, Revenue is perhaps the most respected and professional agency in state government.
And so with all that experience in the State House, you know how things can get political and there can be bluster and there can be critique in the heat of the battle.
Sure.
Now you're leading an agency, so you're supposed to be less political. But analyze for me some of the critique from people like Leader Jim Durkin and from some other Republicans who say Governor Pritzker has not followed through on that pledge of being bipartisan, that there have been no Republican votes on some of his bigger bills so far. Analyze that.
Those are policy decisions on the behalf of the Republicans, but I will tell you the governor has been straightforward. I don't think I'm violating any confidences here by telling you that before he proposed his fair tax initiative and put it out publicly, he met individually with both Leader Durkin and Leader Brady. I was in the room at the time, and he said to them, he said, this is my plan, this is what I'd like to do, I think it's fair. Maybe there are tweaks that you think ought to be made. If there are, come to me, let me know, I'll work with you, see what we can do. Quite frankly, they've made the decision that they don't want to move in the direction of supporting at all the fair tax, but that's their decision. But the governor has reached out. He's reached out to members across the aisle. He's invited them to the governor's mansion for dinner. I think he's made an honest effort to do that.
The overture is there.
Absolutely, I believe so, yes.
You raised the issue of the fair tax. Is it fair to assume that if you were still in the House of Representatives, you would be a Republican vote in the yes column?
Well, I'm not in the House of Representatives, but I will tell you this. At the end of last session, the House Republicans passed or signed on to a resolution saying that they opposed the fair tax or the graduated income tax. At that time, there were 51 members of the House caucus. 50 members signed that pledge or that resolution. There was one who didn't, and you're looking at him right here.
Okay, so an interesting stand to take at the time. And maybe we'll circle back to that in a moment. But first I want to dive into one of the reasons why we invited you here for this discussion, and that was this headline that I had to tell you I had to stop and look twice at. I think even John O'Connor with the Associated Press, his lead started out saying something like, Illinois budget and surplus don't often fit in the same sentence. But in the month of April, when tax receipts were due and filings were coming in before that deadline, you received a bit of good news. Was it as much a surprise to you as it was to some of the rest of us?
Certainly it was a surprise. Certainly it was a surprise, especially at that level. I mean, a $1.4 billion increase in receipts over April of last year was truly significant. So we were very pleased to have it. I will tell you that I agree completely with the governor in terms of how he intends to use it, which is to make the pension payment. And at the same time, we have said you can't run the state of Illinois on hoped for April surprises every year. So the idea of moving to a fair tax to make our budget more stable and our finances on a more positive ground, I think that makes sense.
Let's dig into that a little bit. You said the governor plans to use that money toward the pension payment, but to be clear, that's next year's budget money. He expects that the projections have shifted because of this, right? And so that's next year's budget. He expects to put money in the pension payment. This year, he expected to balance out part of the budget with that extra windfall. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, Mark, the $1.4 billion is obviously receipts that we've received right now. That's $1.4 billion we didn't have before. That now can be used for payments in the future for the pension payment.
But the governor also said there's a $3.4 billion budget or deficit in this year's budget. Are we wrong to assume that $1.4 billion will go to plugging that hole?
And that's part of it, that's correct. And there are other proposals within the governor's budget that he has talked about in terms of revenue proposals that will help bridge the FY20 budget.
So if I read your report and the letter between from you and Alexis Sturm from the Office of Management and Budget correctly, if I read that letter right, it looked like there was enough revenue to adjust projections moving forward, that FY 2020, this upcoming budget, could also assume it would have enough money to pay that $800 million into the pension system. Is that right? Is that?
Well, you are correct insofar as you're right. We project an additional $800 million over previous projections for FY20. So we think we're going to get in an additional $800 million. We were very conservative in terms of how we estimated that, because part of the $1.4 billion that we took this year were, we think, just one-time occasions.
Right.
Exactly right. But going forward, we think that estimates could be $800 million higher.
So maybe this, at the risk of getting into the weeds a little bit here, I am interested how something like this could happen. We saw some Republicans saying, isn't it interesting that the Trump tax cuts contributed to this, but I think that it's a little bit more specific than that. So there was the state and local tax deduction that was eliminated or capped at $10,000, I think. And how did all that lead up to what happened? How did this extra windfall occur?
And we're digging into the sort of the granular nature of it, but remember, we don't see an individual's federal tax returns. We only see their state tax returns, but there are basically three broad categories. Number one, because Medicaid is a 50-50 match program, in other words, we get money from the federal government, we got more money from the federal government this year than we expected. Secondly, as you referred to, the state and local tax deductions. To give you an example, at the end of 2017, I prepaid my first payment of my property taxes because I knew I was not going to get a deduction in 2018. That meant my Illinois income for 2018 was going to be a little bit higher because I didn't take that deduction. So that happens when you have 6 million taxpayers in the state, that happens. And then lastly, we have a 50-year unemployment low, so people are working, that's bringing in more money. Those are the three big categories that we attribute the increase to.
So that last part you mentioned, the economy is doing well nationwide. Some economists fear that may not last. And who knows, I mean, anything could happen. But I guess that exposes part of what some analysts have suggested is a weakness or a vulnerability in Illinois' pension structure. The way that just as quickly as $1.5 billion could show up, it could evaporate next year if the economy were to take a big downturn, and we don't expect it to be that drastic. But how does the state move forward to better insulate itself or the pension system from that kind of an erosion of revenue?
How does it insulate itself? I will tell you, I think one of the key ways it insulates itself is by moving forward on the fair tax that the governor has proposed, because it helps to address, the fair tax helps to address the structural imbalance that we have in the state of Illinois and puts us on a much firmer footing on a financial basis. Additionally, the governor has also proposed pension ideas, which transferring assets into the pension system, continuing the early buyout, using part of the revenue from a fair tax to make the pension payments. So he has a plan for the pension payments going forward, and he's thinking not just in a one-year time frame, but 2 and 3 and 4 years down the road of how he moves our state forward.
Is it fair to say you probably still have strong ties and relationships with members of the House, the Republicans in that caucus?
House and Senate, certainly, yes.
And I hope our audience will forgive, we do have a live rally going on in the Rotunda, and that's providing some interesting background noise here. But you have standing ties and relationships with members of the House and Senate, Republicans both. Has anyone, or would it be appropriate for the governor or anyone in his staff to ask you to lobby them in favor of the fair tax? You're here today on a television station supporting the idea. Have you had any of those discussions with members?
As a member of the governor's administration, I'm happy to talk about the initiatives that the governor has, and I think the fair tax is obviously his key initiative, and I support it. I'm happy to talk to any member of the legislature about why I think it's the right direction in which to move. We're going to get resistance from the Republicans, but I will tell you, in areas where there's strong Republican representation, 98% of their constituents are not going to be affected. As a matter of fact, they're going to be affected beneficially because they're going to see a decrease in their taxes. So
Republicans say that line won't hold. And if it's true that that's going to stay in perpetuity, well then why don't you add a constitutional amendment to say, okay, fine, down the road, if you want to raise taxes, let's lift that to a supermajority of votes as opposed to a simple majority threshold where it is today. Is that a fair proposal?
And Mark, I will tell you, well, first of all, that proposal has been around for a very long time and has never gained any traction. But I will tell you that having been a member of the legislature, the bottom line is, it's not easy to raise taxes.
Is it easier to raise taxes on 10% of the population?
I'm not convinced by that. I don't believe that, because if you look at, let's say that a higher percentage of high-income individuals live up north, and you have a greater penetration now of Democrat legislators up north, those people respond to their constituencies. It's going to be hard to raise taxes no matter what the tax structure is. It doesn't happen often, and I don't buy the argument just because we go to a fair tax that it's easier to raise taxes. I don't believe that.
All right, very interesting. Have you had any of those discussions with Republican legislators about the fair tax and progressive tax? Do you have any hope that one or two of them might break the line and come vote yes?
I'm not a nose counter. I leave that up to the legislative team. I have had discussions talking about obviously the impact perhaps on their districts, but that's a decision that they're going to have to make individually. But I will tell you that legislators recognize the situation in Illinois, and I didn't just represent my district, which hopefully I did in a fair and responsible manner, but I also, as a member of the House, had the bigger perspective of what's best for the state of Illinois as a whole. And I think there are a lot of legislators like that, and I think they're looking seriously at the governor's proposals.
All right, Director Harris, before we let you go, a lot of people who submitted their tax returns, maybe some haven't seen a refund or a return yet. How is the agency doing in a timely fashion of processing those returns?
We're doing great. We had 6.1 million tax returns last year. 5.3 million of them were handled electronically. We think that will be 5.4 million this year. I looked at the data as I get it every day. I look at the data. 66% of the returns that we have received so far electronically are eligible for a refund. Those refunds go out on average in 24 or 25 days after everything is finalized.
All right, well, your third month on the job and you've already found $1.5 billion behind the couch cushions. I think you've raised the bar for expectations. Hopefully you can continue to live up to that with Governor Pritzker and the administration.
Hopefully I can come back next year and say the same thing.
I think we hope so. Director Harris, also a longtime military veteran, thank you for your service and thank you for joining us here today. We're back in a moment with Representative and House Democrat Thaddeus Jones with a discussion about the cigarette tax. Stick around.